جزاهم الله من قراء سورة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغ مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماه العادون ولا يؤدي حقه المجتهدون، الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى تبارك وتعالى، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء وخاتم المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين سيدنا ونبينا بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. واللعنة الدائمة الباقية لأعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم وغاصب حقوقهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: إن الدين عند الله الإسلام. صلوات. We have reached to the eve of Ashura, Shab Ashur, and the religion that Imam Hussain alayhi salam protected by making that supreme sacrifice is the religion of Islam, as brought by the Prophet. And we have been talking about it, that how can this religion which came 1400 years ago be still relevant to us in the 21st century, especially in this part of the world, which is very far away from the Arabian Peninsula. And the answer has been that if we can distinguish the process of what is the continuous aspects of Islam and what are the changes aspects of Islam, we will be able to keep Islam always relevant to our lives. We looked at the process of Hijrat. We looked at even the three important areas where in I'tiqadat there are no changes. Muslims migrated from one part to other. Many new communities and nations came into the fold of Islam, but the Aqidah was not compromised or changed. The rituals were, to a great extent the same, although cultural aspects come into it, and that is no problem at all. But then when we look at the lifestyle of the people, what I would term as the culture of the Muslims around the world, Islam has this ability to manifest in different parts of the world, in different cultural contexts. What Islam says is that there are certain constant values which will never change. Passage of time or location of place will have no impact in the validity of the constant values of Islam. But then the way these values will manifest depends on the given time and the place that you are. And so yes, Zaman and Makan has an impact. We looked at different examples. But tonight I would like to dedicate this Majlis to the tradition of Azadari, being Shab Ashur, and use that as an example of what is the continuity phase of Islam in Azadari and what are the changing aspects of Islam in Azadari. It's relevant to the occasion as well as to the theme that we have. Salawat alayhi. And I'll be using some very contemporary examples to make our young people, the next generation, understand that when we do the azadari the way we are doing it, there is a need to understand what we are doing. Only things will become more meaningful. Otherwise, all these questions will come, whether we should be doing or not, or why we are doing it, what is the benefit of it. And I'll be starting from a very basic level and going on to a higher level. Salawat alayhi. Let us start with the words. Aza and azadari. Aza is Arabic. Aza, ta'ziya, not in the Urdu. In Arabic, ta'ziya and aza are in the same meaning. It comes from the same root. When you add the word dari at the end of it, azadari, it is no more Arabic, it becomes Farsi and Urdu. But the meaning are same. So when you say al-aza in Arabic or azadari in Farsi or Urdu or Gujarati, the meaning is exactly same. And what does aza mean? Aza means to grieve and mourn on a person or an event. And when we look at this meaning, it's not difficult to comprehend that, the meaning of aza and azadari, this is part of human nature. And azadari, basically in that sense, the process of grieving and mourning in a tragedy or loss of someone, this can happen on two different levels. It happens individually, and it also happens on a communal level. So let us first look at the personal level. When we talk about this process of mourning and grieving, on a personal level, this is a very natural phenomenon. You don't have to be a philosopher or a marja taqleed or a allama or a scientist or a psychologist, to understand that. Because when you look at human beings, whenever people see a tragedy happening in front of them, or when they hear about the tragedy being narrated to them, as human beings, on an emotional level, we react to that. So whether you observe it or we hear it, we react on different levels. The most basic level is the level of the heart. Any decent human being, if he sees a tragedy happening in front of him, or he hears about it, in the heart he will feel sadness. So that is the very basic level of azar. That person is impacted by that tragedy. Then there are others. Probably their emotional, aspect is more stronger. You will see it's not only in the heart. They do not only feel the sadness actually it also reflects on their face, and you see that sadness is being expressed. Then a third level, above it. There are people who see the tragedy happening in front of them, or they hear about it, and the impact is not only in the heart and on the face said that they make. Their eyes become watery or teary. And these are very natural phenomena, reactions to a tragedy. Then there are some who will see they even go to a higher level. They actually cry, and the tears start flowing on their cheeks. And then a level even above that. Maybe it depends on the level of tragedy. That the impact is so strong that they do not only have tears flowing from their eyes on their cheeks, but they also cry. And so these are very natural reaction to tragedy when it comes to a human being. Salawat. And sometimes, again, depending on how close you are to that tragedy, how close it impacts on you, Sometimes you will see impulsively individuals will hit their head or their chest or their thighs. Look at some of the scenes that we see in earthquake, for example. When a mother is being shown that this is the body of your baby. Even if they are from non-Muslim, environment, you will see the way they hit their head. And these are very impulsive reaction that you see, or for example, when you look at the Palestinian women, when their houses are bombarded by the Israelis, and if their children die in that process, you will see the scene. Although Palestinians are not Shias. Actually, they are more influenced by Salafi and Wahhabi. But it is human nature. And that happens because the mother is very close to the child. When a mother loses a child, that is a natural, impulsive reaction to tragedy of hitting herself on the head or on the chest. And so when we talk about this issue of, how people react to tragedy, we realize this is a natural phenomenon. You don't need science or religion to tell us about it. Every person can feel that. Not only that, I'll say to the extent that even when people, educated people, sometimes when the narration is so strong and powerful, if it's written in a very beautiful way, very compelling manner, where it really captures your imagination, or if the documentary or the movie is made in that way, you will see very intelligent, educated people looking at that tragedy on the screen or reading it in the words. Although they know this is just a story, they still react very naturally. I haven't been to a movie, but I'm told, women sometimes react to the tragic scenes, that you can even hear the sobbing in the theater. And that's actually part of human nature. Maybe women are more emotional than, emotional compared to men. But my point is that if a person, an intelligent, educated person knows that this tragic scene that I see, or this event that I'm reading in the story, is just a fiction and story, not a real story. But the way it has been written down or, presented, it is so powerful that it touches the emotional level of the person. And this proves that the reaction of a human being to a tragic scene, whether on screen or when they hear about it or read about it, this is part of human nature. Salawat for the next part. And if it's part of human nature, how can it be haram? We have this question from the other Muslims who don't follow the path of Ahlul Bayt. Of course, we are not talking about all Sunnis here, no. A segment of the Sunni Muslims, they ask us, they say, why do you do this? Is it not haram to cry on a person who has died? And our answer is that it's something which is very natural. How can you say this is haram? Actually, this understanding comes from that school of thought, where they have in Sahih Bukhari by Imam Bukhari, who has compiled this book of Ahadith. In his section on Kitab al-Janaiz, dealing with funeral rites in Islam, he has certain subsections, about 3 of them. But one of them, the title is, إِنَّ الْمَيِّتْ لَيُعَذَّبْ بِبَكَاءِ أَهْلِهِ عَلَيْهِ. Literally it means, verily the deceased is punished by Allah because the family members are crying on him. This is the title of that section of hadith. And then they have a hadith saying that if a person dies, and if the family members cry on that person because of losing him, that person who has died will be punished. يُعَذَّبْ. He will have azab from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This issue on a rational level as well as the religious level is not acceptable. It doesn't make sense. If crying on the deceased is haram, then the azab of doing that haram should be on the person who is crying. Why on the deceased? The poor fellow cannot even do anything. He hasn't done anything. He's dead. Somebody else is crying on him, and he is going to be punished. We don't believe in Allah where the haram is done by one and the punishment goes to the other. So shar'an or aqlan, it doesn't make sense. The problem is that this is actually based on the attitude of the second Khalifa. He was in habit of, aggressively preventing people from crying on their dead in the funerals, especially the women. There is one, and these are all narrations not from our sources, where the Prophet actually forbid him from doing this. And the words used by the Prophet are very interesting, where he says, when he was forbidding the women from crying in one of the janazas, in the family of the deceased, the Prophet says, دَعْهُنَّ يَا عُمَرْ فَإِنَّ الْعَيْنَ دَامِعَ وَالْقَلْبَ مُصَابٌ وَالْعَهْدُ قَرِيبٌ. Leave them alone, Umar. O Umar, leave them alone, because verily the eyes shed tears. وَالْقَلْبَ مُصَابٌ. And the hearts are sad. And the loss is very fresh. Three things the Prophet mentioned. Number one, it is the function of the eyes to cry. Don't stop them for that. Number two, the reason why the eyes are shedding tears is because the hearts are sad. And the reason why the hearts are sad, because they have very recently, lost somebody who was dear and near to them. Let this natural phenomenon go through. Who are you to stop that? And so whoever comes to you and say it is haram and bid'ah to cry, let alone in azadari, even in the funerals, say we do not follow the sunnah of the second Khalifa, we follow the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This is there in Mishkatul Masabi, this event. And even Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal narrates that, and even Imam Nasai has narrated that. Abdullah bin Abbas once mentioned this issue, this attitude of the second Khalifa on this issue, to the famous wife of the Prophet, al-Mu'minin Aisha. And he said that, this is what he is saying. That if a person dies, if the family cries on that person would be punished. And he's trying to relate it to Rasulullah. She responds by saying, لا والله ما حدث رسول الله إن الميت لا يعذب ببكاء الحي عليه. She says, by Allah, Rasulullah never said that. By Allah, Rasulullah didn't say that the deceased will be punished when the family cry on him. Rather, she says to Abdullah ibn Abbas, حسبكم القرآن. Quran is a sufficient guide for you. And she recited this ayat from Surah number 6, ayat 164, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. No soul will carry the burden of the sins of the other. So if the haram is done by one, the punishment should go there and not to the other person. Salawat. Can I ask the brothers to move forward, please? So crying is a very natural phenomenon. There is no issue of hurmat from our point of view. अगर बंदिश है तो आंख पे नहीं है, जबान पे. If there is any prohibition, it's there on the tongue, not on the eyes. You can't stop people from crying when they lose someone. What Islam says is that at that moment, do not complain against the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the prohibition goes on the tongue, not on the eyes. There is nothing which says that you are not allowed to mourn and grieve at that time. Look at the example of Prophet Yaqub. Lost his son, although he knew he's alive. And what happened? تَوَلَّ عَنْهُمْ. He turned away from the other sons who brought this news. And then he says, Quran says, وَقَالَ يَا عَصْرَ عَلَى يُوسُف. Expressed his sorrow and sadness for losing Yusuf. وَابْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. And out of this sadness, huzn, the grief and mourning in a way for losing his son, not being able to see him, he cries so much that even he loses his eyesight. You're Nabiullah doing that. We have our own prophet. When the son was born and then taken away by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ismail, the son from Maria Qibtiyya. And Rasulullah cried at the grave when he was being buried. And somebody said, Rasulullah, you? And Rasulullah said, yes. I'm a human being in that sense. I also have emotions. And I react in that way. And so when we look at this issue of, on a personal level, how people react to a tragedy, by mourning and grieving, crying, shedding tears, on a personal level, there is no problem. On a rational level, as well as from the Shari'i point of view. Salawat. Now this was all about individuals. What about having azadari on a communal level? The way we do now. We gather as a community to mourn and grieve on the tragedy of Karbala. This depends on the nature of tragedy. If a tragedy takes place in any part of the world, in any community, if it is of a national level, international level, or a religious proportion, the people who are part of their community or nation or religion, they will collectively express their mourning and grieving for the tragedy that has befallen upon them. And this is very obvious, when we look at what is known as memorial services here in the western part of the world. It is to remember those whom they have lost in the wars or different tragedies. Tonight I would like to give an example which I have been using for the last 10 years. About 9/11. We are not talking about the event as an event. Why it happened, who did it, all these conspiracy theories about it. No, that's not my topic. But when this event happened, and when I noted down some of the observations from how the American nation and the people here reacted to this tragedy, I was able to actually look at that as a way of explaining our own azadari to the new generation. And I've been doing this for the last few years, and I would like to even share my thoughts in this gathering for especially the young people. Salawat. 9/11 happened in Manhattan, downtown New York. It was a tragedy. Americans lost about 3,000 people. But that loss was not of individuals. The attack was not because there were those individuals working there. It was on a nation, on a community. And therefore the sympathy was not limited to that neighborhood of Manhattan, downtown New York, or just the city of New York. No, he went all to the state of New York, the United States of America, even Canada, and across the world. Many, many nations around the world organized special ceremonies as memorial services for the victims of 9/11. Almost all countries of the world sent sympathy messages to the American nation, including Libya and Iran, who did not have good relations with the United States of America. But this was a tragedy, unprecedented in the American history, at least in the current history. And so the whole world, in a way, felt, sympathetic towards them. And then when you look at the events 6 months after that event, White House made an announcement, very interesting, which was termed as 6 months anniversary memorial. And when I heard that, I said, well, I know among the Shias we have Chemahi or Chemasi in Gujarati, where you say Majalis. When somebody in the family passes away, we have a Majalis on the sixth month after their passing away. Who came up with this idea in the White House? I don't believe there is a Shia there. But my point is that when the tragedy hits you at home, you will react in the same way the way it hits us when we remember the tragedy of Karbala. There are no rules and regulations in Christian tradition or any other tradition that 6 months after the passing of that tragedy, you have a special ceremony. But they did it. And this is where we come to realize it all depends whether this is your tragedy or not. What is the level of hurt that you are feeling? And that will actually show you the level of reaction towards a given tragedy. Salawat. And this has become an annual event. In the American history, it will be there. And even Canada, being the neighbor, have been respecting that. And so this is where we see that when we talk about, commemorating events on a national or a religious level, this is also part of the norm that we see even in the 21st century in the western part of the world. Salawat. Let us go back to the days of the Prophet. Was there a sense of communal grieving and mourning? We talked about individuals passing away and families grieving and mourning. Yes, we have. In the second battle of Islam, known as Battle of Uhud, in the 3rd year of the Hijrah, the Muslims again became victorious, but because a segment of the archmen placed on the hills at the back abandoned their position against the commands of the Prophet, orders of the Prophet, the victory was taken away, and the Meccans were able to attack them from the back, and the victory changed into defeat. When the Prophet came back, among those who were lost was the uncle of the Prophet, Hazrat Hamza. When the Prophet comes into the city of Medina from Uhud, passing by different alleys, different neighborhoods, he would hear the women grieving and mourning their shuhada of their family. When he reached to his own neighborhood, and Hamza lived close by, but Hamza at that time in Medina was alone. When the Prophet passed by, he realized there is nobody in the house of Hamza. Unlike the Ansar, whose families are there, people are mourning and crying for their shuhada, nobody is there. Felt sad about it. And he expressed his sadness by saying, لكن عم حمزة فلا بواكي له. All the shuhada, they have families to cry and mourn and grieve them. But my uncle Hamza, there is nobody in his house. The Ansar heard that the Prophet is saved. They went to their homes and asked their women to stop whatever they are doing. They said, go to the house of Hamza. Remember him, mourn him, grieve on him before you do that for your own shuhada. And this became a tradition. This is something which I myself came to know very recently. That this became a tradition that whenever people would gather to remember the shuhada, first they will remember Hamza, and then they will remember the other shuhada of the time. And when the Prophet heard about it, he prayed for them, and he said, may Allah be pleased with Ansar and the children of Ansar and the descendants of Ansar for doing this azab for my uncle. And remember that after the events of Uhud, Hamza was known as Sayyid al-Shuhada. This title stayed with him until the events of Karbala happened and the shahadat of Hussein overshadowed the shahadat of Hamza. And the title now moved to Hussein. So if you see that azadari done during the days of the Prophet, for other shuhada also, but first they will start with Hamza. But because of the greatness of the tragedy of Karbala, Hussein becomes the Sayyid al-Shuhada. And so in whatever events that we have tragedies, we always remember the tragedy of Hussein bin Ali alayhi salatu wassalam. So this communal azah that we are talking about, this is based on the sunnah of Rasul. The words of Rasul are there. The silent approval of the Rasul is there. There are three forms of sunnah. Sunnat qawli, sunnat taqriri, and sunnat fi'li. And even the third sunnah, sunnat amali, where the Prophet himself did something. Maulana Shibli Nu'mani, a very prominent Sunni alim of India, has a very famous book by the name of Sirat al-Nabi. There he talks about the Prophet once coming back from his journeys, passing by Uhud, stopped at the grave of Hamza 7 or 8 years after the event of Uhud. And according to him, the Prophet cried on that grave as if Hamza had been killed on the same day. So although it's 7 or 8 years passing, still Hamza is being mourned and grieved. Because he was not a person who died as an individual. He was the shaheed of Islam and a martyr for our faith. Salawat. Let me divert slightly that when we talk about communal azadari, I think Hajj and the ceremonies of Hajj become an example for us and a way of justification for the azah that we do as a community. What is Hajj? Hajj, in a way, is reliving the experience of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, the first Muslim, as Quran calls him, the one who submitted himself to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what do? Besides doing tawaf around the house built by him and Ismail, most of these ceremonies are surrounding the events of Ibrahim and his family. In Mina, the main, activities done on the day of Eid. You go through those 3 pillars. That Islam which has total abhorrence with anything to do, even remotely to idol worshipping. It says that 3 places where Shaitan tried to prevent Ibrahim from fulfilling his obligation of Qurbani. And those 3 places where he appeared and Ibrahim stoned him, Muslims have erected pillars symbolizing Shaitan. And we are told to stone that. And once you've done that, then you reach to the point where basically you do the Qurbani. And what is that for? Everything is symbolism. If we do not believe in symbolism in Islam, there is no sense in going for Hajj. And if we accept symbolism in Islam, then Azadari of Sayyid al-Shuhada can be very easily explained in the symbolic sense. If you look at even the process of Qurbani that we do, the lamb that we buy there, where is it from? Is it the descendant of the lamb which came by Jibreel from the Jannah? Huh? No, these are all from Australia or New Zealand. Not even in Arabia. But what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? إِنَّ الْبُدْنَ مِنْ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ. Even that animal of sacrifice that a Haji is taking is from the sha'air, symbols of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Have nothing to do with the lamb which Jibreel brought. It's not from the same descendancy. Let me use the term we use. It is a shabi of that and not the real. But the Quran uses the word shi'a'ur Allah. It is the symbol of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a symbolic sense, not in the real sense. And so when you look at the tragedy of Karbala, we are told to, the tragedy of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the willingness of sacrifice. Then we look at the tragedy of Karbala and we say we have to keep that also alive. In both situations, the order was to willingly sacrifice. But we celebrate Hajj and we commemorate Karbala. Because the difference is Ibrahim did not actually do the sacrifice. He expressed and proved his willingness, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaced Ismail with the lamb. But when it comes to Karbala, it was not only that he has to sacrifice for the sake of Islam, he actually did the Qurbani and the sacrifice. So the events are on both same level. But one sacrifice didn't take place, so you celebrate that success of Ibrahim. And here you commemorate the Qurbani of Hussein bin Ali in Karbala. Salawat. And so when we talk about the tragedy of Karbala and the Azadari that we do, it is not just a cultural issue. It is for us a religious issue. It is based on religious foundations. Even before Karbala, the event is foretold. We have from Musnad of Ahmad bin Hanbal and other sources of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, where Jibreel came to the Prophet at the time of the birth of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and I'm sure you're familiar with the stories, where he even told the Prophet, what will happen to this grandson of you who was born today? And the way he described the narrations of Karbala, the Prophet could not stop from crying. Let me take this Azadari back to that level. That the first Majlis of Azaf Sayyid al-Shuhada was on the day of his birth in Medina, where the Zakir was Jibreel and the Sami was Rasulullah. Jibreel was doing the narration of the tragedy and Rasulullah was crying. That is in the Islamic history, the first Majlis of Hussein bin Ali alayhi salatu wasalam. Salawat. And that is why our Imams who came after Karbala, they have, each one of them, they face different problems in their lives, different challenges and suffering. But everybody says, remember my grandfather Hussein. You know, the only Imam to die in the prison is the seventh Imam. But go and ask Imam Raza alayhi salam, whom should I remember? He will not mention his father. He will say, remember Hussein. And so this is the sunnat of the Ma'sumeen. The order for going for ziyarat of Hussein. Especially on the day of Arba'een. According to the 11th Imam, one of the 5 signs of a Shia is to go for ziyarat of Hussein on the day of Arba'een. The emphasis on reciting the ziyarat of Hussein from far away. It's amazing that even when the days in Islamic calendar have nothing to do with Hussein historically, but still the order is, do ziyarat of Hussein. 1st of Rajab, nothing to do with Hussein. 15th of Rajab, nothing to do with Hussein. 15th of Sha'ban, everything to do with the Imam of the time. But we are told, do the ziyarat of Hussein. Shab-e Qadr, nothing to do historically with Hussein, but part of the Amal, do the ziyarat of Hussein. Eid al-Fitr, it's Eid, but remember Hussein. When we talk about the day of Arafah, ziyarat of Hussein. Eid al-Azha, ziyarat of Hussein. And these all ziyarat and the commands have come from the Imam. That we have to keep this memory of the tragedy of Karbala alive at all the times. On a practical level, the way our Imams encourage the poets of our community to compose poetry, marsiyah, in their own words, because the poets have some leeway as far as imagination is concerned. It's different from narrating history. And so they were encouraged, and, you know, alhamdulillah, on Saturday night we had a poetry competition for the youths. Mostly the girls participated. But the product that I saw, in English language of course, is encouraging. We might lose the language, but we will not lose the azah of Sayyid al-Shuhra. If you look at the way they describe the narrations, one looked at the last farewell of Sakina with her father, from the eyes of the horse. You know, others talked about the issue of the choice that Hur was finding himself between Hussein on one side and Yazid on the other side. And so, you know, the way they put the words, this is encouraging for us. And we have to realize our Imams during their own times encouraged the Shia poets to compose marasi for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Not only that, they actually would ask them to come to their homes, where the Imams and their family members and companions with a parda on the side, where women of the family would sit on the other side. And Imam would ask this poet, how do you have a good mercy on my grandfather Hussein? This is 6th Imam's event. Recite it. And he recited another one. Imam said, no, I heard something else, which is more moving. Recite for me entire marsiyah. And he recites. And the men were crying, and even the women behind the curtain were crying. And so we see this is sunnat amali of our Imams. Not only that, that they used to even reward the poets who used to compose poetry for the sake of Imam Hussein bin Ali alayhi salatu wasalam. Salawat. The ahadith emphasizing the simple act of crying for Hussein. We talked about the phenomenon of, crying earlier, that is part of human nature. But the ahadith saying, for example, man baka wa abka wa tabaka, wajabat lahul jannah. Look at the words. Whoever cries on Hussein, whoever makes other cry on Hussein. Aw tabaka. It's very interesting, the word tabaka, which means somebody who just makes the face of somebody who is crying. Even if he is not able to cry, just making this sad face. Wajabat lahul jannah. Jannah becomes wajib on him. Of course, there are conditions there. But the emphasis on crying, making others cry, and making the face of somebody who is crying. Let me just read one narration to you, and I don't think I have to worry about the time tonight. A person by the name of Rayyan bin Shabib, companion of the sixth Imam, on the eve of 1st of Muharram, visited Imam Riza alayhi salam. Salawat for me. And Imam says to Ibn Shabib, is it the first night of Muharram? And Ibn Shabib said, yes. And then Imam started remembering Imam Hussein. And he said, you know, the month of Muharram is a sacred month in Islam, where hostilities are forbidden. Muharramul Haram. But these Muslims did not even have the decency of respecting that month, and they killed Hussein and his family. And then he goes to talk about it more, and then he says something, and I would like you to really imbibe these words of the Imam. Just one sentence where he says, Yabna Shabib, in kunta baki'an li shay'in. This is a ma'soom. He says, oh son of Shabib, if you have to cry for anything, when he says li shay'in, he is taking the whole universe into the consideration. If there is anything that you have to cry for, from Adam to the Khatam, to Ali to Imam Raza, whom should you cry for? He says, in kunta bakiyan li shay'in fabka' lil Husayn. If you have to cry for anything, then cry for Hussein. You know why? He says, فَإِنَّهُ ذُبِحَ كَمَا يُذْبَحُ الْكَبْشِ. Because Hussein was slaughtered the way the sheep is slaughtered. You know, just think the way Imam is portraying that tragedy. Many Anbiya have been killed. All our Imams, other than the present one, we believe they were killed. But they were killed by poisoning. Yes, Ali was attacked by the sword. But he didn't die right away. He died because of the poison in which the sword had been immersed, which went all the way to the brain of Imam and affected the whole body. But there is only one Imam. That Imam Riza alayhi salam says, فَإِنَّهُ ذُبِحَ كَمَا يُذْبَحُ الْكَبْشِ. He was slaughtered the way a sheep is slaughtered. And therefore you have to remember Hussein. And therefore you have to cry on Hussein. And therefore you have to mourn on Hussein. You know, in Islamic laws we are told when you slaughter a sheep, you have to first give water to the sheep. When the fourth Imam used to pass by the market, and if he passes by a butcher's shop, they used to put a cloth on the meat. Because if Imam would see it, he would stop. And he would ask the butcher, did you give water to the sheep? And when he will say, yes, your grandfather ordered us to do that. That is where he will remember, but my father, he was slaughtered without being given water. And so remember that. This is a legacy, this is a tradition, this is a sunnah, which has come from the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salatu wassalam. Salawat. The Shia mazhab is based on law. And law demands. We can not only relate to our Imams on intellectual and rational level. That is the foundation, yes. But our attachment to the Imam has to move from the level of intellect to the level of the heart. That's where the law comes in. And the demand of law is that we have to be happy for their happiness, and we have to hurt, and we have to feel the hurt when they suffer and go through tragedies. And that is what we do. And so when we talk about the Azadari of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, even this process of masa'ib and crying, even on a communal level, remember this is part of our religious tradition. This form of azar and this aspect of azar is the constant value in the religion of Islam. Yes, there are variable forms and manifestations of azar which would change from time to time and place to place. But the foundation of azar is based on religious principles. It is essentially a religious tradition. The environment affects us. Time and language, time and space has an impact on us. And so that is where you will see the diversity and the variety in the manifestation of Azadari in the Shi'i world. Look at the language. You know, Marsiya was done in the Arabian society in Arabic. When Shi'ism reached to Persia, you know, they basically, in a way, transform Azadari in their own cultural form. And now the Marsiya and Noha were done in Farsi. Then Shiaism moves to South Asia, where the language of Muslims became Urdu. And Marsiya and Noha became in Urdu. And so this transformation and change and variety will come. But the essence of Azar is part of our religious tradition. And let me just emphasize the point that all these new evolving things which become part of the tradition of Azadari, although they evolve later on and gradually because of the impact of the environment, the time and the space, they are no problem as long as they do not conflict with any Sharia or the value or the principles of Islam. That is the criteria. And so, for example, when we talk about the process of matam the way we do, yes, this is a cultural manifestation of the original azar. The way it is done in unison by the whole group, with the Noha being recited, whether it's done by people standing in lines, or doing the saf matam, or just sitting down. Different communities do it in different ways. But there's no problem in there, because there is no prohibition in Sharia about that new innovation. When we talk about the julus, for example, the whole purpose is to basically convey the message of Imam Hussain to the rest of the society. Whether we do it effectively or not is a different issue. But by itself, there is no problem. It's part of the evolving nature of the traditions of Azar. When we talk about alam, you know, the display of alam is basically the display of the courage and loyalty of Abbas. This is in the memory of Abbas. When we put the water bag, the mashq, this is actually a display of the thirst of the children and the women and the men in Karbala. When you look at the process of the cradle, Jula, you know, this is in memory of Ali Asghar. And it symbolizes the innocence of Ali Asghar and Hussein through him. And it also displays the brutality of the Yazidi forces. And so there's all symbolism that we talk about. And even the horse taken out in certain cultures, in the Julus, symbolizes that riderless horse. That now the leader is gone. The horse is there, but the leader is no more. All these issues, as long as they do not conflict with the basis of Sharia, there's no problem there. It has to be understood properly. It has to be taught to the next generation in the right way. And since azadari itself is an amal, it is an action, it comes into the jurisdiction of ijtihad and taqleed. So if there are any issues about certain things which is done in azadari, in one part of the world or the other part of the world, the final judgment will come from marji taqleed and not from individuals on this issue. Salawat. I use the example of 9/11 as a way of understanding the symbolism of our azadari. Let me go back to one more example. As I said, these are the observations that I had based on that tragedy of 9/11. Before I go to Urdu, one more example. Part of the people who were killed in 9/11, in those two buildings, were about 300 to 400 firemen of New York City. And of course, the bodies of everybody was not found. One of the firemen was an individual whose body also was not found. And because there is no body, there is no funeral. For the family of that fireman, it was a big issue. Because normally if you have a funeral, it's kind of a closure for the tragedy and the event for the family. But if the funeral doesn't take place, it is an open-ended issue. They are still psychologically suffering through it. So that family decided to go through the funeral anyway, whether they get the body or not. So everything was arranged. A funeral was arranged normally with a coffin wrapped in U.S. flag, put on the fire engine, taken from the fire station to the church, with the policemen and the firemen lining on both sides with the people, showing their respect to that fire engine, carrying that coffin with the flag of America on it. At the church, the coffin was taken out, brought down with full honors, taken inside the church. The priest did everything which is done normally in the funeral. Then it was brought back and put on the fire engine. It's only then that I noticed the remarks of the TV reporter, and that's why I remember this event all the time, where she said, but the coffin was empty. The coffin was empty. What do we do on the day of Ashura? What is tabut? This is 21st century. New York City, United States of America. They are Christians, not Muslims. They don't know anything about our culture. But it is the issue of emotion. Where they thought for them to reach to that closure, it was important to have that, even if the coffin is without the body. When we take out this taboo, why? Because we are told it is wajib kifaya for all Muslims to bury a Muslim, even if it's a person who is your enemy. But by taking out that taboo on the day of Ashura, we are in a way saying to Hussein, we feel the pain of your family, that your taboo was not taken out. You were not buried the way you should have been buried. And it is also a protest against those thousands in Karbala who used to recite the kalima of Rasulullah, but didn't have the decency of burying the grandson of that same Rasul. Not only that, they ordered 10 horsemen on the basis of volunteer to come forward and trample the body of whom? And that is why when Zainab saw that scene, she looked towards the heavens and she said that, "Oh my grandfather, the angels recite salawat on you, but come to Karbala and see what is happening." So when we talk about this issue of Azaa of Sayyid al-Shuhada, it's a point of thinking about it. Understand what it is. Educate to the next generation what it is. And only then we will be ensuring that this Azaa continues in the future generations in this part of the world, inshallah. Salawat. عاشور کے دن جو اعمال ہم کرتے ہیں، ہم نے کہا تھا نا کہ کربلا اور حج، اگر آپ حج کے فلسفے کو سمجھ سکتے ہیں تو کربلا کے فلسفے کو سمجھنا مشکل نہیں ہے۔ عاشور کے اعمال میں ایک ہم عمل کرتے ہیں جس میں کہا جاتا ہے جہاں آپ ہیں وہاں سے چند قدم آگے بڑھیں، 7 مرتبہ یہ کام کریں۔ جب آپ یہ 7 مرتبے کی بات سنتے ہیں تو ہمیں جو ہے حج کے ارکان یاد آتے ہیں۔ ارکان حج میں ایک سعی ہے، طواف اور نماز طواف کے بعد حاجی جو ہے صفا اور مروہ کے درمیان سعی کرتے ہیں، صفا سے مروہ، پھر مروہ سے صفا، 7 مرتبہ ایک ڈائریکشن میں۔ آخر یہ صحیح میں ہے کیا اور اس کی بنیاد کیا ہے؟ یہ کسی نبی کا کام نہیں تھا کہ جو ہم فالو کر رہے ہیں۔ نبی کی زوجہ تھی اور نبی کی ماں تھی، یہ جناب ہاجرہ سے تعلق ہے اس کا۔ ابراہیم کو حکم تھا کہ آپ کے امتحان میں سے ایک امتحان یہ ہے کہ یہ بیٹا ہم نے آپ کو دیا ہے ضعیف العمری میں، لیکن اب امتحان یہ ہے کہ آپ انہیں جا کے ایسے علاقے میں چھوڑ کے آئیں جہاں کچھ نہ ہو، آبادی بھی نہ ہو۔ ابراہیم گئے، مکہ کے جو وادی ہے وہاں انہوں نے چھوڑا، جتنا کھانا اور پانی تھا وہ دیا اور چلے گئے۔ کچھ وقت کے بعد پانی ختم ہو گیا۔ اسماعیل جو ہیں ابھی انفینٹ ہیں، شیرخوار بچہ ہے۔ پانی جب ختم ہو گیا، بچے کو پیاس لگی، تڑپنے لگا، ماں اب پانی کی تلاش میں نکلی، صفا کی پہاڑی کی طرف گئیں، نظر گئی مروہ کی طرف، محسوس ہوا کہ وہاں پانی ہے، جاتی ہیں مروہ تک، دیکھا کچھ نہیں۔ وہ انگریزی میں کہتے ہیں میراج، گرمی میں اگر آپ دور دیکھیں تو آپ کو نظر آئے گا جیسے پانی ہے، وہ پانی نہیں تھا۔ مروہ کی طرف مڑ کے صفا کی طرف دیکھتی ہیں، وہی منظر نظر آتا ہے، دوبارہ آتی ہیں، لیکن صفا میں بھی پانی نہیں تھا۔ دوبارہ مروہ کی طرف گئیں، 7 مرتبہ صفا اور مروہ کے درمیان جناب ہاجرہ گئی۔ اب یہ ہمارا اپنا ایک تجزیہ ہے کہ اگر ابراہیم ہوتے ہاجرہ کی جگہ تو ایک بار مروہ کی طرف جاتے، دیکھ لیا پانی نہیں ہے، دوبارہ صفا کی طرف دیکھتے کہ پانی نظر آ رہا ہے، جاتے، دوبارہ مروہ کی طرف نہیں جاتے، اس لیے کہ باپ جو ہے عقل سے کام لیتا ہے، ماں جو ہے اپنے ممتا کے جذبات سے کام لیتی ہے۔ یہی فرق تھا۔ ہاجرہ رکتی نہیں ہے، ٹھیک ہے ایک بار دیکھ لیا پانی نہیں ہے لیکن پھر جاتی ہے، پھر صفا کی طرف آئیں، پھر نہیں ہے، 7 مرتبہ۔ یہ ممتا کا جذبہ تھا اور خداوند عالم کو یہ ممتا کا جذبہ اتنا پسند آیا کہ کہ اس نے تا قیام قیامت حج کے ارکان واجب میں سعی کو قرار دیا. یہ جو آپ سعی کرتے ہیں در حقیقت یہ دس از سیلیبریشن آف مدرہوڈ. ماں کے جذبے کی تقدیر ہو رہی ہے، اس کو اپریشیٹ کیا جا رہا. لیکن جناب ہاجرہ کے اس جذبے میں اگر آپ دیکھیں، خداوند عالم نے صلہ میں زمزم کا چشمہ پیدا کر دیا. ہاجرہ نے اپنے بیٹے کو سیراب کیا. لیکن کربلا میں بھی ایک اور سعی ہوئی تھی. وہ بھی ایک شیرخوار بچہ تھا. باپ یہاں ماں کی بات نہیں تھی بلکہ باپ کی بات. اور اسی لیے آپ حج کے ارکان کو کربلا کے واقعات سے ملائیں تو آپ کو بہت کچھ ملے گا اس میں. اصحاب کی شہادت کے بعد، بنو ہاشم کے افراد کی شہادت کے بعد، امام نے جب آخری اتمام حجت کے بعد استغاثے کی آواز بلند کی ہے تو بعض روایات کے مطابق اصغر نے جس طرح سے اپنے جھولے سے گرا دیا تھا، اہل حرم نے کوشش کی کہ اصغر کو خاموش کریں، لیکن وہ بچہ خاموش نہیں ہوا، بلکہ بیویاں اس بچے کو دیکھتے ہوئے رونا شروع کر دیتی. اس کے رونے کو دیکھ کر آواز حسین کے کانوں تک پہنچتی ہے. آتے ہیں خیمے تک، کہتے ہیں زینب رونے کی وجہ کیا ہے؟ اس وقت جناب زینب نے کہا کہ اصغر نے اپنے کو جھولے سے گرا دیا. اور بہت کوشش کی گئی، جناب رباب نے بھی کوشش کی، ہم نے بھی کوشش کی، لیکن وہ بچہ خاموش نہیں ہو رہا ہے. اس وقت جناب امام حسین علیہ السلام زینب سے کہتے ہیں اصغر کو لے آؤ، ہم کوشش کریں گے اس کے لیے پانی میسر ہو سکے. رباب تک یہ پیغام پہنچا. رباب آتی ہیں در خیمے تک اور اصغر کو حسین کے حوالے کرتی ہے. اس ماں نے کتنی امیدوں کے ساتھ اپنے بچے کو حوالے کیا. حسین نے اصغر کو اٹھایا، جاتے ہیں مقتل تک. ابا کے دامن سے سایہ کیا تھا، ابا ہٹائے. لوگوں نے دیکھا کہ حسین کے ہاتھ میں ایک ششماہ بچہ ہے. امام نے اس وقت ایک جملہ کہا ہے، واقعاً انکساری کی حد ہے کہ حسین آج مجبور ہو چکا ہے ششماہے کے لیے پانی کی طلب کرے اور بھیک مانگے. کہتے ہیں ہم تمہارے گناہگار ہیں، اگر کچھ کیا ہے ہم نے تو ہم سے بدلہ لو، ہم قصوروار ہیں. اس بچے کا کیا قصور ہے؟ ان لم ترحمونی فرحم هذا الطفل الصغیر، اگر مجھ پر رحم نہیں آ رہا ہے تو اس بچے پر رحم کرو. 3 دن کی بھوک اور پیاس کی وجہ سے اس کے ماں کا دودھ بھی خشک ہو چکا ہے. عزاداران حسین کوئی جواب نہ ملا. آخر اصغر کو زمین کربلا پر لٹا دیتے ہیں کہ اگر تم سمجھتے ہو کہ اس بچے کے بہانے ہم خود پانی پینا چاہتے ہیں تو لو اپنے ہاتھ سے اس کو سیراب کر دو. عزاداران حسین اس کا اثر بہرحال یزیدی سپاہ میں ہوا ہے، اور اس اثر کو دیکھتے ہوئے ایک مرتبہ عمر بن سعد نے ہرملہ کو حکم دیا، اے ہرملہ اقطع کلام الحسین. یہ کلام حسین کیا تھا؟ یہ تاثرات تھے بخشش ماہے کی معصومیت کے جو سپاہ میں پھیل رہے تھے. حسین نے اصغر کو اپنے ہاتھوں میں بلند کیا عزاداران حسین، اصغر حسین کے ہاتھوں پہ ہے 3 شعبے کے ایک تیر چلا اور گلو کو ذبح کرتا ہوا حسین کے بازو میں آ کے پیوست ہو جاتا ہے. بچہ حسین کے ہاتھوں میں ایک مرتبہ تڑپ جاتا ہے. جب خون جاری ہوا حسین نے اپنے ہاتھ میں جمع کیا اور آخر میں اپنے چہرے میں خون کو مل لیا اور کہا خدا بندہ قیامت کے دن اسی معصوم کے خون کے ساتھ تیری بارگاہ میں شکایت لے کے آئیں گے. عزاداران حسین، امام حسین کے لیے اس شہادت کے علاوہ سب سے مشکل مرحلہ اس کے بعد کا مرحلہ تھا، اس لیے کہ جب خیمے کے قریب جاتے ہیں حسین نے سوچا کتنی امیدوں سے رباب نے دیا تھا اصغر کو، کس طرح سے رباب برداشت کر سکے گی. حسین کی ہمت نہ ہوئی کہ اصغر کو اس کیفیت میں رباب کے حوالے کرے. دوبارہ مقتل کی طرف جاتے ہیں، زمین اپنے تمام وسعت کے باوجود حسین کے لیے اتنی تنگ ہو چکی تھی. 7 مرتبہ صحیح کرتے ہیں لیکن زبان پر یہی تھا رضا بقضائه وتسلیما لامره. عزاداران حسین، شیخ عباس قمی ایک روایت بیان کرتے ہیں کہ اس وقت آسمان سے ایک آواز آئی، یا حسین دعوه فی التراب ان له مرضعا فی الجنہ. اے حسین اصغر کو دفن کر دو مٹی میں، ہم نے جنت میں دودھ پلانے والی کا انتظام کر دیا ہے. عزاداران حسین، اس جملے کو جب ہم تاریخ میں دیکھتے ہیں دل یہی کہتا ہے یقیناً فاطمہ نے دعا کی ہوگی کہ خدا بندہ رباب برداشت نہ کر سکے گی، حسین کو حکم دو کربلا میں اصغر کو دفن کر دے. مولا گھوڑے سے زمین پہ آتے ہیں، زمین کربلا پر بیٹھے اور ایک ننھی سی قبر کھودی اور کس طرح سے اس باپ نے اپنے ششمائے کو دفن کیا ہے اس کی کیفیت کوئی بیان نہیں کر سکتا ہے. لیکن اتنی بات ضرور ہے کہ جناب اصغر کا جسم بہت ہی نرم تھا اور کربلا کی خاک بہت نرم تھی. پتہ نہیں کس طرح سے حسین نے اصغر کو دفن کیا ہے. مولا اٹھتے ہیں اور خیموں کے باہر پہنچے. جب جناب سکینہ نے دیکھا بابا کا ہاتھ پکڑا اور کہا بابا اندر آئیے. جناب رباب سامنے آتی ہے، کہتی ہے مولا میرا بیٹا کہاں ہے. حسین نے ابا کا وہ دامن ہٹایا جہاں تیر کا نشان تھا اور بتایا کہ بیٹا ذبح ہو چکا ہے. بس رباب کی زبان سے صرف ایک جملہ نکلا، یا علی امثلک یذبح، اے علی اصغر کیا تجھ جیسا ننھا بچہ بھی کربلا میں ذبح کر دیا جائے. لعنت اللہ علی القوم الظالمین. ماتم حسین.
کربلا کی فضاؤں میں اب تک ایک دکھیاری ماں کی صدا ہے. کربلا تیرے اس ہو کے پن میں کس کو میں لال کہہ کے بلاؤں، کس کو سینے سے اپنے لگاؤں، لوریاں دے کے کس کو سلاؤں، ہائے اصغر کہیں کھو گیا ہے، اس قدر یہ زمین تجھ کو بھائی، یاد بھی ماں کی تجھ کو نہ آئی، دے رہا ہے جو داغ جدائی، بول اصغر میری کیا خطا ہے، تو اگر روٹھ جائے گا جانی، کیسے ہوگی بسر زندگانی، پاس کوئی نہیں ہے نشانی، تیرا جھولا بھی اب جل چکا ہے، ہو نہ دل ٹکڑے ٹکڑے کسی کا، یوں مقدر نہ بگڑے کسی کا، اس طرح گھر نہ اجڑے کسی کا، جیسے تاراج گھر یہ ہوا ہے، کربلا کی فضاؤں میں اب تک ایک دکھیاری ماں کی صدا ہے، یا حسین یا حسین۔